Part 24. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 231. Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "Lolita, pervert. Is that your purpose? You're trying to trick me with delicious food. I tell you, I won't take the bait. I'm the high and mighty Red Dragon King Betty." Humph. She got down from Chen Tao's arms, climbed onto the bed, and lay down on her own, pulling the quilt and getting into the bed. Chen Tao looked at Betty lying in the bed, and said, "Are you going to sleep?" When Betty heard this, she was startled, and she sat up quickly. She almost forgot that there was a Lolita here. If she continued to sleep like this, wouldn't it be like hinting at something? She had to let him go. Betty said, What do you want to do? Damn Lolita, get out." Hearing this, looking at Betty's angry look, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, he smiled, and said, "It doesn't matter if you say I'm a Lolita, but I still feel a little uncomfortable when you scold me like this." As a punishment, Chen Tao said as he took off his shoes. Seeing this, Betty got nervous. "What are you going to do?" Chen Tao got on the bed and got into the quilt. Betty got out of the quilt as if she was stung by a scorpion. Chen Tao stretched out his hand, held Betty's little hand, and pulled. Betty's small body was pulled over by Chen Tao. Chen Tao closed his hands, held her in his arms, and lay on the bed. The quilt was pulled and covered. Betty's face turned pale. She wanted to struggle, but Chen Tao was too strong and she couldn't move. Betty was nervous. Is the thing she has been afraid of going to happen? Chen Tao said, "Don't struggle, I promise I won't do that to you." Betty was slightly startled, and she relaxed a little after hearing Chen Tao's promise. She relaxed, and Chen Tao also relaxed a little. He looked at Betty and said with a smile, "As a punishment, I will hold you to sleep today." Betty's face flushed and she said, just sleep." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Are you looking forward to something else?" "No," Betty said, "who would look forward to something else? You are obviously the pervert. If you want to look forward to something, you are the only one who will look forward to it." Looking at Betty's reaction, Chen Tao smiled. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Then don't move, let me hold you to sleep." When Betty heard this, she pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Chen Tao hugged Betty, closed his eyes, felt her softness, and slowly rested. Betty didn't move, and Chen Tao didn't move either. Betty found that Chen Tao was really just sleeping and didn't plan to do anything else. Realizing this, Betty also relaxed a little. As long as she didn't cross the last line of defense, she didn't care. Slowly, Betty was a little tired. After all, this body was too different from the past, and it consumed too much energy too quickly, so she was tired too. Unconsciously, she closed her eyes. Wait until the next morning. The sun shines in from the window. Betty slowly regained consciousness. As soon as she regained consciousness, Betty felt very comfortable. Warm. In the past million years, Betty has never had a good sleep, and this time is the only time she slept the most comfortably. Very warm, this feeling is better than the feeling in the quilt in winter. Betty's eyelashes moved, and she slowly opened her eyes. She looked ahead and saw the figure of a man. She closed her eyes again, and she remembered that she fell asleep in the arms of this man when she slept. Is this the embrace of a man? Betty has been working hard for so many years to fight for her breath. From the feeling of love between men and women, she felt the warmth and difference from a man for the first time. Thinking of the kiss before, Betty's heart was confused. That kiss, does it count? If it counts, then wouldn't she be his dragon girl? It shouldn't count, right? Awake, at this moment, a voice interrupted Betty's thoughts. Betty was startled, she raised her face and looked at Chen Tao. Found that he was looking at her, He smiled and said, "Get up, give me a good morning kiss first." Betty blushed, glared at Chen Tao, and said, "Lolita control, big pervert, wishful thinking." She came out of Chen Tao's arms, turned her back to Chen Tao, and didn't look at him. Seeing Betty's reaction, Chen Tao smiled. At this moment, Betty heard the movement from behind her. She heard the sound of getting out of bed, and she could also hear the sound of getting dressed. She heard the sound of the door opening and closing. Betty turned around and looked at the door, but found that it was closed. Seeing this, Betty's eyes were shining, and she slowly sat up and leaned against the head of the bed. Betty had a different emotion in her heart, which made Betty feel a little strange. "Do I like that Lolita?" "Humph," Betty snorted and said, "No way, unless I'm crazy." After that, a few days passed. Chen Tao would bring food to Betty every day and visit Betty. Occasionally, Betty would be punished by Chen Tao because she didn't pay attention to what she said. The punishment was actually just to sleep in her arms. A full week later, Betty lay in bed, looking at the alarm clock on the bedside table. The alarm time was 8 o'clock in the morning. 8 o'clock. Chen Tao didn't come today? Betty looked at the ceiling, not knowing what she was thinking. That day, Chen Tao really didn't come. A day passed. The next day, Betty opened her eyes and looked at the time on the bedside table. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. She stood up and leaned against the head of the bed. What happened? Betty suddenly felt inexplicably panicked. What happened to that man? Is he not coming? No, Betty could remember the man's appearance and the way he looked at her. That was the look of a Lolita control. He couldn't not come before he got her. Why? Did something happen? When she thought of Chen Tao's accident, Betty felt her heart tighten. She hurriedly got out of bed and walked to the door, trying to open it. But the door just wouldn't open. For a moment, Betty was anxious. "Man," Betty shouted loudly. But there was no movement. Betty's heart felt like it was being held by a big hand, and she felt very uncomfortable. She didn't want to care about anything now, she just wanted to know if the man was safe. This thought was very strong. "Asshole, lock me up. If something happens to you, how can I help you?" Betty was very anxious, tears welled up in her eyes, and she was almost crying. "Man, are you still safe? What are you doing now?" Betty shouted loudly. "If you are safe, tell me, I am so worried." Betty's heartbeat quickened, and she was very uneasy and terrified. Life is so fragile, and the man is just an ordinary person, he may die at any time. What to do? Betty has never felt so panicked before. She felt like her precious treasure was suddenly taken away by someone. That panic and fear were stronger than if she was killed. Squeak. Suddenly, Betty heard the sound of the door opening. She was slightly startled and looked at the door. The door slowly opened. Chen Tao walked in from the door. He looked at Betty and said with a smile, "What's wrong?" Betty's eyes lit up when she saw Chen Tao. She couldn't help but say something. She ran over and threw herself into Chen Tao's arms, saying, "I thought something happened to you." Chen Tao was stunned. He looked at Betty in his arms. He was silent. Chen Tao originally just thought Betty was interesting, so he played with her. But Chen Tao realized one thing, that feelings are something that cannot be played with, otherwise it will cause trouble. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 232. Chen Tao picked Betty up horizontally and took her to the edge of the bed and put her down. Betty sat on the edge of the bed. With her little lowly body, she looked at Chen Tao with her big ruby-like eyes. Because of the change of emotions, her eyes were filled with a trace of moisture. Her big eyes just stared at Chen Tao. Seeing this, Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't worry, I was just too busy these days and didn't come." I'm sorry to make you worry. Betty pursed her thin lips, puffed her face, and looked at Chen Tao. You didn't tell me that, really. Seeing Betty's scolding look, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile, stretched out his big hand, lifted a few strands of hair on her cheek, and put them behind her ears. Betty's cheeks were flushed, and she looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. Suddenly, she closed her eyes, tilted her face slightly, and opened her mouth slightly. She looked like she was ready to be picked. Chen Tao was stunned, looking at Betty in this Lolita state. Although she is cute, her action has given Chen Tao a very clear message. Betty has been captured by Chen Tao. Chen Tao was a little confused. To be honest, Chen Tao was just teasing Betty, just wanting to see what the Red Dragon King of the Red Dragon clan, who was expelled by the dragon civilization, would do when facing a Lolita control. But Chen Tao didn't expect that she seemed to become serious after teasing her like this. Simple, yes, the dragon civilization is the same. Most of them are pure warriors. When it comes to feelings, they are like a blank sheet of paper. If others want, they can freely draw on their blank sheet of paper. Although Betty is the king of the Red Dragon clan, she is also just a pure warrior. When it comes to feelings, she only has a blank sheet of paper. After being teased by Chen Tao, her heart quietly deviated from the track. Chen Tao looked at the beautiful face in front of him, he gently stroked her small cheek, leaned close, and kissed her lips. It was a seal. Proof that her relationship with him had quietly changed. The lips parted. Betty slowly opened her eyes, and there was a trace of moisture in her ruby-like eyes. She blushed, lowered her head, and did not dare to look at Chen Tao. Chen Tao was slightly startled. This scene was too cute. A petite person, just lowered her head slightly, looking at her toes. What a lovely picture. Chen Tao smiled, sat next to Betty, stretched out his big hand, hugged her slender shoulders, looked at Betty. Betty leaned against Chen Tao, a happy smile on her face. Seeing Betty's expression, Chen Tao smiled mischievously and said, "So, have you already planned to sacrifice yourself for me?" Ah, Betty was stunned for a moment. She looked up at Chen Tao and said, "You wish?" Lolita, pervert. I don't want that kind of thing. She looked ahead, her expression was full of nervousness. Chen Tao looked at Betty's reaction, he wanted to tease her even more. He said with a smile, "Why are you so nervous? Aren't you the Red Dragon King? As a king, don't you have any experience at all?" Betty's face turned even redder, she glared at Chen Tao and said, "Do you think we are all the same as you, a Lolita? Always thinking about those weird things. We, the Red Dragon clan, are pure warriors, we only need to fight. We are not interested in other things. That kind of thing has nothing to do with us." In other words, no experience. Chen Tao summed up the key points. Betty couldn't help but glared at Chen Tao. Humph. She came out of Chen Tao's arms, she looked at Chen Tao and said, "Didn't you say you had something to do? Why don't you get out of here?" Betty didn't want to talk to Chen Tao about the kind of topic she couldn't accept. Hearing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. He stretched out his hand, took Betty's wrist, and gently pulled Betty into his arms, letting Betty sit in his arms. Betty twisted symbolically, and then stopped moving. She said, "What are you doing?" Betty blushed. Chen Tao gently put his arm around Betty's waist and said, "Do you want me to leave so much? I'm in the mood now." Betty's heart skipped a beat when she heard it. She looked at Chen Tao fiercely and said, "Don't make a fuss, let's talk about business." Asking herself from the bottom of her heart, Betty is not so repulsive to Chen Tao now. If Chen Tao really wants to do something, Betty probably won't be willing to resist. But she was not mentally prepared for that kind of thing, and she didn't want this Lolita control to succeed so quickly. Betty turned slightly to the side, looked into Chen Tao's eyes, and said, "It's been so long, and I still don't know your name, Lolita Control, what's your name?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty's inquiring eyes. That's right, Chen Tao has been sleeping with Betty for so long, and Betty still doesn't know Chen Tao's name, which is indeed not fair. Chen Tao thought about it and said with a smile, "My name is Chen Tao." Betty was startled. Chen Tao. Such a familiar name. Suddenly, she remembered something, and she looked at Chen Tao fiercely. "You are the king of dragons, Chen Tao." She remembered now, she had heard of this name before. It's called Chen Tao. Once she realized the identity of the person in front of her, Betty's face changed slightly. You lied to me." Looking at Betty's slightly trembling ruby eyes and that shocked little face, Chen Tao's eyebrows relaxed slightly, and he looked at Betty. "I didn't lie to you." Betty bit her lower lip, her eyes were filled with tears, and she struggled to get down from Chen Tao's arms. For a moment, Betty felt deceived. This man was Chen Tao, so he must know everything. He had been lying to her since he saw her. For a moment, Betty felt very wronged. She struggled to get down from Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao stretched out his hand and hugged her tighter. Betty couldn't move. She cried, "Put me down, you bastard, you liar, you lied to me." The dragon people are a simple civilization. As the Red Dragon clan expelled from the dragon civilization, although they have different ideas from Katie, they are also simple in terms of feelings. Betty had already put her heart on Chen Tao, but she found that she was deceived. This feeling made Betty a little collapsed. Chen Tao looked at Betty like this, he hugged her, and then blocked her crying mouth. Betty moaned, slowly, and stopped moving. After a long time, they slowly separated. Betty looked at Chen Tao, her ruby eyes were hazy. Chen Tao looked at Betty and said with a smile, "Do you still think I cheated you now?" Hearing this, Betty slowly retracted her gaze, not looking at Chen Tao, but just leaned on Chen Tao's arms obediently, not saying a word. Looking at Betty's absent-minded look, Chen Tao gently stroked her arm and said gently, "Don't worry, I will treat you well." Lolita Control, pervert. Betty couldn't help but curse softly, "Still a liar, a big liar." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 233. Chen Tao smiled, hugged her, got on the bed, put her under the quilt, and hugged her gently as before. Betty closed her eyes and snuggled into Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao could see through her look of enjoyment. She seemed to enjoy staying in Chen Tao's arms. Chen Tao leaned close to Betty's ear and said, "Are you comfortable?" "Shut up," Betty said without any politeness. Chen Tao smiled and said in her ear, "Being my woman, I can experience it more comfortably." Betty hit Chen Tao's chest with her small fist. "Pervert, Lilicon." Chen Tao said, "Isn't it good?" "No. Don't think about it anyway. Just like before, sleep with me in your arms." How could Betty agree to that kind of thing? She is the Red Dragon King. Sensing Betty's little resistance, Chen Tao smiled. The two enjoyed the tenderness. After a while, "Hello," Betty's voice sounded. Chen Tao said, "What's wrong?" Betty said softly, "Are we in Dragon City?" Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled, "Of course not, this is Earth, a pre-nuclear civilization." Yes, Betty said, "I just said, why is the scenery different from Dragon City?" Chen Tao looked at Betty. Betty closed her eyes when talking and nestled in Chen Tao's arms. This scene was very cute. "No," Betty blushed and said, "let's wait until I'm mentally ready before we talk about that, okay?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "Yeah. I heard from Katie before that you are a combination of genes and elements." How did you do that? Chen Tao changed the subject to himself. Betty's cuteness makes Chen Tao a little bit too much. Betty closed her eyes. The elemental body is a kind of creature made of matter. Most of them are different from us, but they also have something in common. Their core is actually made of genes. Speaking of which, their core is actually the same as them. The brain controls the entire body. From this perspective, they are actually not that different from us. Betty said, we have been studying the core of the elemental body, and then we got this cutting-edge technology that fuses our genes with the core genes of the elemental body. I thought that with the core technology of the elemental body, we could move freely and horizontally. The whole universe, it seems I'm overthinking it. Betty, who was listening to her lowly figure, said these words in a milky voice. Chen Tao felt his heartbeat speed up slightly. When this girl wasn't talking, her sleeping baby face was very cute, and now that she was talking like a baby, her face was even more adorable. Chen Tao couldn't help but get close to her face and kissed her baby face. What are you doing? Stop making trouble. Betty blushed and hid her little face further into Chen Tao's arms. However, her face was flushed and there was a touch of uncontrollable joy in the corners of her mouth. She felt a little uncontrollable joy. Chen Tao said, so, do you have any other plans in the future? He said with a smile. Betty said, what else can I plan? My people are all elites over there, and there are hundreds of thousands of them. But they were stopped by 3 little girls, and so many of them were killed. Even I, part of my own genes were also broken up, and I became what I am now. I think you're quite cute like this, Chen Tao said with a smile. Betty slowly opened her eyes, raised her face, glanced at Chen Tao, and said, pervert, Lolakan. These 2 words seemed to have become Chen Tao's titles. Chen Tao smiled. Humph. Betty looked away and said, I don't care about you, as long as I find that part of my gene, I will become what I was before. When Chen Tao heard this, he smiled, stroked her hair, and said, with your size, it's just right to hold her. If you look like before, I guess it won't be as comfortable as it is now. Is that so? Betty seemed to dislike it a little bit. If that's really the case, then I have to think about it. Hearing this, Chen Tao smiled. It seemed that this embrace was quite tempting to her. But, Chen Tao was thinking. Many people say that elemental bodies are simply composed of elements, but looking at Betty's research, this is not the case. The elemental body should also be a type of gene body, because the most important thing about the elemental body is the core, and the core itself is composed of genes. This is the same as the enchanting spirit. You must know that the enchanting spirit is also a body made of genes, but her genes have the power to write the code of nature. As for the elemental body, if you want to talk about it, isn't it also a charm? Part of the body is made up of genes, and their bodies are made up of natural coding. In other words, genes are the basis of organisms in the known universe. The so-called elemental body is just the product of evolved genes that write the code of nature to form a body. Once you figure this out, everything will be clear. There are no elemental bodies or enchanting spirits in this world. In fact, all the creatures in the world are made up of genes. Genetic organisms are the real subjects of this world. Got it? Everything is clear. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Betty in his arms, and the more he looked at him, the more he liked him. Betty opened another world for Chen Tao and revealed another secret of the universe. Thinking of this, he leaned close to Betty and kissed her cheek. Ah, what's up? Betty was unwilling, puffing up her cheeks. Seeing Betty's unwilling look and reaction, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. So cute. Husband. Suddenly, Chen Tao heard a voice from the gene channel. Chen Tao slightly stretched his eyebrows and said, what's wrong? Those troublemakers are here again. Valia's voice came faintly. According to Bashi, the other party is a person from the 5th universe named Stir, a 5th generation gene body. I'm letting Dragon Joe fight them now. Chen Tao said, Dragon Joe. Chen Tao didn't say much. Although Chen Tao didn't want the dragons of the dragon civilization to fight against the strong men of foreign civilizations, but thinking back, the dragon warriors also need to be trained. Especially as the Dragon Joe with the oldest qualifications on the front line. Valia has Valia's ideas. Chen Tao didn't say anything. He said, I'll go over and take a look right away. What's wrong? A milky voice came from the side. Chen Tao looked down and found Betty looking at him with her big eyes. Their eyes met. Chen Tao smiled and said, well, there's something going on. Do you want to go and see? Betty's eyes lit up when she heard it. You want me to go out? Chen Tao said, well, I can't keep you locked up all the time. Betty pursed her lips and said, then I'm going out. Chen Tao smiled, okay, then, do you want pants? Betty was startled, her face flushed, she rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, Lolita control, big pervert. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 234. Chen Tao still didn't give Betty pants, but gave Betty an ultra-short black pleated skirt paired with a pair of white pantyhose. On her feet was a pair of small black leather shoes. Betty is small in stature and has skin as fair as jade. Wearing this outfit, she looked like a little princess walking out of a fairy tale. Her red dragon horns and wings add a unique charm to people. Chen Tao said, put away the dragon horns and dragon wings first, they don't match this outfit well. Ah! I don't want it, Betty quickly resisted. Chen Tao smiled, rejection is invalid. When he raised his hand, Betty's dragon horns and wings disappeared. Seeing this, Betty puffed up her cheeks, looked at Chen Tao angrily with her big eyes, and said, I'm walking so slowly now, and you even took away my wings. Bad guy. Chen Tao smiled and said, if you are not afraid of being exposed when you fly, I am not so refusing. Upon hearing this, Betty was startled. She bit her thin lip and said, it's not all your fault for giving me such a short skirt. She felt aggrieved. Look at Betty puffing out her cheeks and crossing her arms, looking angry. Chen Tao smiled, raised his hand, and hugged Betty into his arms. Betty was hugged by Chen Tao. She was stunned for a moment and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Betty and said with a smile, I'll hug you so you won't walk too slowly. Betty was slightly startled, her eyes looked at Chen Tao, and a blush appeared on her face. That's okay, if you want to hug him, I don't care. She turned her face away from Chen Tao and looked ahead. Seeing Betty's little reaction, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, okay, let's go. Wait a minute, you haven't told me where you are going, Betty said quickly. But the surrounding environment changed. Betty was stunned for a moment and looked around subconsciously. When she looked around, she saw Katie sitting on a chair with her legs crossed. Seeing Katie, Betty's face changed slightly. Suddenly Betty knew where this place was. This was the Dragon Man's Hall. The place where dragon people discuss things. Chen Tao actually brought her to the Dragon Man Hall? Betty hid her face on Chen Tao's chest, not daring to look up. She was afraid of being recognized by Katie. If she was recognized by Katie, it would be the end of her. Chen Tao felt Betty's nervousness. He showed a smile, withdrew his gaze and looked at Vilya and Katie beside him. Wei Lia's eyes glanced at the little Lolita in Chen Tao's arms, and she said, who is that in your arms? After hearing Vilya's question, Betty stiffened slightly. Chen Tao felt Betty's nervousness. He looked at Wei Lia and said with a smile, she is one of your sisters. I will introduce it to you later. How is the situation now? Seeing that Chen Tao did not reveal her identity, Betty was slightly relieved. Only then did she dare to raise her face and look around. She raised her face and found that Chen Tao was looking ahead. Betty also turned her face sideways and looked forward. There is a huge blue screen ahead. A pitch black space can be seen in the screen. In the space, stood a man with white hair. The man stood in space, looking indifferently at the female dragon Joe in front of him. Wei Lia said, "They just met and haven't started fighting yet." Hearing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly. Chen Tao withdrew his gaze, took Betty, put Betty on the chair, and asked her to sit down. Betty looked at Chen Tao and said, "I want to hug him." She stretched out her little hand towards Chen Tao. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and she looked at Chen Tao with uneasiness in her eyes. Seeing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but feel happy. Betty usually can't do things like coquettishness, but the problem is that now there are Katie and Villia next to Betty. Betty was afraid of being found out, so she wanted to hide in Chen Tao's arms. Perhaps Chen Tao's arms could give her a greater sense of security. In this way, the way Betty stretched out her hand and said these words looked more like a little girl. This made Chen Tao laugh, and he said with a smile, "Don't be afraid, just sit here. I have something to do now, so I can't hold you." Betty bit her lip, crossed her arms across her chest, and said, "Huh, if you don't want to hug me, I won't hug you." She turned her face sideways, looking angry. Seeing Betty's arrogant look, Chen Tao smiled. However, Chen Tao has no time to tease her now. It's a good thing to let Longren Jiao exercise, but the problem is that Chen Tao doesn't want anything unpleasant to happen. Now that Chen Tao is looking at this scene, he can help Long Renqiao at any time, but if Chen Tao looks at the scene and lets Long Renqiao get into trouble, Chen Tao will not be able to forgive himself. Within the screen. "I asked you to call Chen Tao out, but a woman came." Ste's voice was a bit sharp, and his pupils were white. His eyes were coldly staring at the woman in front of him, and he said lightly, "You woman, aren't you afraid of death?" Dragon Man Jiao was wearing silver armor and holding a silver sword. He looked at Sturt indifferently and said, "I am Dragon Man Jiao, a warrior of Dragon Man. In this universe, we Dragon Man maintain the balance of this universe. Any obstruction will prevent the balance of this universe. Everything in the balance of the universe is our enemy. And your existence has threatened the balance. As a warrior of the dragon people, I am not interested in knowing who you are looking for. I only know that the intruder who destroys the balance of the universe must be killed. Clear?" As he said that, Dragon Man Jiao pointed the sword in his hand at Ste, with the tip of the sword pointing straight at Ste. Stur narrowed his eyes, stared at the Dragon Manjo, and stretched his eyebrows slightly, saying, "I understand, you don't know what fear is, so you dare to say such words in front of me, the god of the universe, Ster in this case, then I, the god, will give you fear and let you know what the fear of falling into the abyss is." Stur raised his hand, and a dark sphere emerged from his hand. "What is that?" Valia frowned. Chen Tao frowned and said, "It is an energy ball condensed by 10,000 decibels of ultrasound." "Ultrasonic weapon." Betty, who had planned to keep silent, couldn't help but speak. Chen Tao nodded slightly. Betty frowned and said, "How could that guy have such an idea to use ultrasound as a weapon? Vacuum cannot propagate, and that kind of weapon has no effect in space, and the maximum upper limit of sound that can be propagated in air is 200 decibels. This kind of weapon is completely useless." Chen Tao said, "He wrote ultrasound on a substance and created a spherical ultrasound ball. As long as he uses it, this ultrasound will instantly produce a singularity and a black hole. Even if it is a fourth-generation gene body, it will die if it is hit by a black hole." Betty's pupils condensed slightly, and she looked at Chen Tao. "You mean, he is using ultrasound to create a black hole for a destructive attack? This attack method is too crazy. Joe, can you bear it?" Valia looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, "If I am hit by a black hole, the terrifying gravity will tear everything apart, but my super concept armor can be immune to physical damage. If I am really hit, I can't be sure when it will happen." While they were talking, The two people in the picture have already started. Dragon Man Joe held the sword and said, "Cosmic God. It's just a gene with high technology. The power of technology seems to have made you so arrogant." "Humph. You're looking for death," Stir snorted coldly, waved his hand, and shot the black ball in his hand towards Dragon Man Joe. The speed was so fast that it was shocking. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 235. Dragon Man Jiao couldn't dodge at all, and his body was directly hit by the black ball. Bang! There was a muffled sound. Dragon Man Jiao's body flew backwards, flying a full 20 meters away before he stopped. Ste's pupils condensed and his eyebrows wrinkled. 10,000 decibels of ultrasonic waves can cause space to collapse and create a black hole. STE uses technology to condense the power of ultrasonic waves into the sphere. The moment the ultrasonic waves hit the enemy, the ultrasonic waves will break open the space and create a black hole. The terrifying gravity of a black hole is enough to tear apart 4 generations of genes. It stands to reason that if this attack continues, the woman in front of him will be swallowed by the black hole in an instant. But the scene in front of him made STE a little puzzled. What's going on? Dragon Man Jiao looked at the silver-white armor on her body, and her eyes fell on STE. Wei Lia, who saw the scene through the screen, her eyebrows slightly stretched, she said, "It seems that your super concept armor is quite useful." Chen Tao crossed his arms and said, "It would be great if this super concept armor is enough to deal with the god of the universe from the 5th universe in front of us." Wei Lia said, "You think it can't be done?" Chen Tao said, "I hope so, but I can't think too absolutely about everything." Within the screen, Dragon Man Jiao stared at STE and said, "It seems that you, the god of the universe, are nothing more than that." STE's eyebrows wrinkled slightly and he said, "Through your data, I can see that your body only has the level of 3 generations of genes. No, what are you wearing?" He discovered something unusual. Dragon Man Jiao snorted, "What I wear has nothing to do with you, just suffer death." As soon as he finished speaking, Dragon Man Jiao jumped up and rushed towards STE, the silver-white sword in his hand glowing with thunder and lightning. Suddenly, both STE and Dragon Man Jiao disappeared from the spot. "This is..." Vilia's face became more solemn. Chen Tao frowned. In the other world, he used the power of the computer behind him to open the other world. Katie said calmly, "The battle of technology is not only about the equipment on the body, but more importantly, it is the battle between the mainframe computers and the mainframe computers. It seems that Vilia lost." "Lost?" Wei Lia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Does this mean you lose?" Although Vilia has gained a lot of knowledge through the Dragon King's Academy, she is still somewhat lacking in cutting-edge technological battles. Katie said, "Dragon Joe cannot move. Although he has the super concept armor given by Chen Tao, the problem is that the armor can be analyzed. Although the computer behind Chen Tao is very powerful, it is difficult to analyze the armor written by Chen Tao. But as long as there is enough time, it will be analyzed. In the world of Stre, time will not pass in his range. In other words, he has a lot of time analysis armor." Katie looked at Vilia and said, "When the armor is analyzed, Dragon Joe will definitely lose." Damn it, Chen Tao seemed to realize something, and his expression changed. His figure disappeared from the spot and came into space. Enter the world of Stetri. The sight that caught his eye made Chen Tao clenched his fists. Within the world, STE stood in the world full of blue codes, holding a silver-white armor in his hand, but Dragon Man Jiao had disappeared. STE looked at Chen Tao and said, "Are you here? In this world, time does not pass." In other words, just after STE pulled Dragon Man Joe into the other world, although it seemed to the outside world to be just a moment, time had already passed for a long time in STE's other world. During that period of time, Ste can slowly dissect Dragon Joe's armor and then kill Dragon Joe. Chen Tao clenched his fists, looked at Ste, and said, "Where is Dragon Manchiao?" Ste's eyebrows slightly stretched, and he said, "Dragon Joe? Oh. Are you talking about the woman with the horns? She humiliated me, and I was very unhappy, so I killed her. This thing she left behind, it's quite interesting." Dead. Chen Tao's heart suddenly sank, and anger surged into his heart. "You deserve to die." He stared at Ste and raised his hand. The world of Stetri covers an area as large as a planet. The moment Chen Tao raised his hand, another world enveloped the surroundings. The planet in the distance was still in its original state. After Chen Tao raised his hand, everything around him and all the matter that could be seen turned into a blue code. Seeing this scene, Ste's always calm face changed slightly. Inner world? Such a huge inner world. Ste looked at Chen Tao suddenly and said, "What's going on with the performance of the celestial computer behind you?" Chen Tao stared at Ste and said, "You don't need to know what's going on." Ste was slightly startled. He frowned and was about to move, but suddenly found that his body could not move. He looked down and found that his entire body had turned into code blue, and his entire body was normal only from his neck up. Seeing this scene, Ste's expression changed. His pupils trembled and he looked at Chen Tao in disbelief. You can analyze me. It's impossible. My body is already the 5th generation of genes. It's impossible for you to analyze me in such a short period of time. My body has analyzed it. This universe, even this big universe, cannot have such a computer. Steve couldn't believe what he was seeing. This has completely surpassed Stir's common sense. Chen Tao said, "It doesn't matter if you don't believe it or not. Tell me, where is that woman?" Dragon Manchiao is a special existence for Chen Tao. She is Lin's good sister. At the same time, when Chen Tao had not yet completely mastered the power, Dragon Manchiao took the initiative to enter the Earth Star and help Chen Tao. Now Chen Tao is the king of dragons, and Dragon Manchiao is his right-hand man. But he just watched the woman who had done him a favor and was also his right-hand man die tragically. Chen Tao couldn't accept this. Stir's face turned pale. He stabilized his emotions, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "I said, she is dead." Dead. Chen Tao said, "Where is the data?" Stir said, "I used a 10,000 decibel ultrasound to bombard her, creating a black hole. The black hole swallowed all the data in her body and crushed it into quantum. There is nothing left at present." Chen Tao clenched his fists, and he stared at Stir. "You deserve to die." Stir opened his mouth, and before he could make a sound, his body was swallowed by the blue code. Stir's code was directly cleared by Chen Tao. Just like that, Stir evaporated directly, and there was no such person as Stir in the whole world. Time resumed. Chen Tao was the only one left in the entire space. Chen Tao looked at the empty space. Chen Tao shook his head, and his figure disappeared on the spot. When he appeared again, he appeared in the Dragon Hall. Seeing Chen Tao coming back, Valia and Katie looked at each other, and they looked at Chen Tao. Valia looked at Chen Tao and said, "Where is Joe?" You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 236. Chen Tao turned around and turned his back to Wei Lia. He looked at the scene in front of him and fell into deep thought. Dead. But Chen Tao did not answer Wei Lia. Dragon Man Zhou died, and it was a death that left nothing behind. Chen Tao can indeed rewrite Dragon Manchiao's data and recreate Dragon Manchiao. But the question is the rewritten Dragon Manchiao still the same as before? No, that can only be said to be a recreated person, not Dragon Man Xiao. He wanted to resurrect Dragon Man Xiao until he had some data, even a little bit of Dragon Man Xiao's data, so that Chen Tao could feel that the resurrected person was still the same person. But now, Chen Tao had no choice. Is there really nothing we can do? Chen Tao felt a flash of inspiration in his head. Time travel? Yes, if you want to save Dragon Man Xiao, this is the only way at the moment. Time travel is one of Nebula's functions, but Chen Tao has never used this function and has no chance to use it. Want to use it? Tao Weilia had a bad feeling. She stood up and looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao looked at Weilia. Weilia's face did not change at all, but the luster in her eyes was trembling. She obviously realized something. Chen Tao said, I'll bring her back. There is a way to save Longren Xiao, but if he doesn't use it due to his own reasons, it would be very inconsistent with Chen Tao's character. After saying that, Chen Tao said to Xingyun in his heart, Xingyun, I want to go back to the past, can I do it? Please set the time. Nebula's mechanically familiar voice sounded in Chen Tao's mind. Chen Tao said, I want to go back 20 minutes ago. After receiving the order, start the time machine. Time travel is starting. Start counting down, 10, 9, 8, 3, 2, 1. Start time jump. Chen Tao felt that the scenery around him was like a movie being rewinded quickly. The environment has changed. The time jump is completed. A voice sounded in Chen Tao's head. Chen Tao came to his senses. What is that? A voice came from beside him. Chen Tao looked back and found that Weilia was looking at the scene in front of him. Chen Tao raised his face and saw that both Ste and Dragon Man Xiao were in the picture. Ste held a black sphere in his hand and stared at Dragon Man Zhou. Dragon Man Xiao held his sword and stared at Ste. See this scene. Chen Tao's heart moved. Back. Ste waved his hand violently, and the black ball hit Dragon Man Zhou. Seeing this scene, Chen Tao disappeared from the spot. He stood in front of Longren Xiao and waved his hand. Slap on the black sphere. The black sphere was directly shot away by Chen Tao. A black hole cannot hurt Chen Tao, who is a 6th-generation genetic body. King seeing Chen Tao appear, Dragon Man Xiao was slightly startled. Chen Tao turned his face slightly and looked at Longren Xiao, step back, let me deal with this person. Dragon Man Xiao nodded slightly, yes. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Ste, who looked at Chen Tao, squinted his eyes and said, you are finally here. Chen Tao looked at Ste and said, yes, I'm here, and it's time for you to die. As he said that, he raised his hand towards Ste. Ste was slightly startled. He seemed to realize something and looked at his hands. The hands slowly turned into sand, and the sand slowly dissipated. Ste's entire body turned into black sand, and the sand turned invisible and disappeared into space. After dealing with Ste, Chen Tao looked at Longren Xiao and said, let's go. Dragon Man Xiao was slightly startled, and she nodded. Chen Tao and Dragon Man Xiao returned to the Dragon Man Hall together. As soon as he returned to the Dragon Hall, Chen Tao said subconsciously, I brought her back. He looked at Vilia. Weilia and Katie were looking at Chen Tao with doubtful eyes. Vilia stood up slowly. She looked at Chen Tao and said, Tao, the purpose of letting Dragon Man Xiao fight with that man is to train Dragon Man Xiao. After all, warriors of Dragon Man civilization need to fight to improve themselves. We can't always rely on your ability. Hearing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled. It's different from what I imagined. Yes, different. Chen Tao only jumped for 20 minutes and returned to the past 20 minutes from the future. But what happened in those 20 minutes is gone. Chen Tao previously promised Weilia to bring back the dead Dragon Man Xiao, but in the current timeline, Dragon Man Xiao did not have any accidents. Even, she has never fought against Ste. Therefore, neither Wei Lian nor Katie knew why Chen Tao suddenly did what he did. After all, in Wei Lia's view, Chen Tao is here, and as long as something happens, he can save Dragon Manjiao immediately, and Dragon Manjiao will be fine. Huh, how stupid, a voice came from the side. The voice is Milky. Wei Lia was startled and looked at the speaker. It was Betty who spoke. Betty was sitting on a chair with her hands folded across her chest. Her body was too petite and the chair was too big. When she leaned on the back of the chair, she had her feet crossed and looked very cute. Betty looked at Wei Lia and said, "There is a giant computer behind him. If he uses the giant computer to open the other world, block that time, and then kill Dragon Joe. No matter how fast you are, can you save it?" Villia was slightly startled. Katie frowned slightly and said, "The world is not completely static." Chen Tao looked at Katie. Katie looked at Chen Tao and said, "It's just that compared to the time in the outside world, the time in the inner world is relatively slow, very close to a static state. And with the celestial computer behind Chen Tao, he can step into the other person's inner world in an instant. Moreover, I think it will take time for the other party to analyze the conceptual weapon on Dragon Manjiao." Humph, Betty said, "You're betting, if the time it takes for the other party to analyze and kill Dragon Manjiao is less than the time it takes for Chen Tao to enter the other party's world, then Dragon Manjiao will die." Katie was speechless for a moment. "That stupid," Betty scolded her in disgust. Betty, a little Lolita, folded her hands on her chest and cursed, which made her even more adorable and made her not angry. Chen Tao walked to Betty and stretched out his hand. Betty was startled. "What are you doing? What are you doing? Don't hug me." But Chen Tao had already picked her up. Betty sat on Chen Tao's arm, her small body leaning in Chen Tao's arms. She looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes and puffed her cheeks. Chen Tao laughed and said, "Didn't you want to hug me just now? Why don't you want me to hug you now?" Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "If I say I want it, I'll take it. If I don't want it, I won't take it." Chen Tao smiled, looked at Kati and Villia, and said, "The matter is settled, I'll go back first." With that said, Chen Tao was about to leave. "Wait a minute," Villia suddenly said. Chen Tao paused slightly. Villia said calmly and slowly, "Did you know that Dragon Manjiao would die, so that's why you did this? And, you just said you brought Dragon Manjiao back. What did you mean?" Villia's keenness allowed her to detect something was wrong. Chen Tao pondered for a moment and said, "I can only tell you that if you let Ste open the other world, Dragon Manjiao will die. My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 237. Looking at the place where Chen Tao disappeared, Villia frowned slightly. Kati looked at Villia and said, "What did you see?" Villia sat down slowly on the chair. She looked at the picture in front of her and said lightly, "Chen Tao, I don't think he is the kind of person who would say something inexplicable and do something inexplicable. He was too abnormal just now. It feels to me, he seems to have experienced something." Villia frowned and said, "And it was experienced when he was with us." "What do you mean?" Kati looked at Villia. Villia said, "When Chen Tao came to us, he tacitly agreed with my approach. I can feel that he also wants to temper Chiao." Speaking of this, Villia looked at the Dragon Manjiao next to him. The Dragon Manjiao's face was full of confusion and puzzlement. She didn't know what happened. Villia retracted her gaze and said, "Just now, he changed his mind very suddenly, which is very strange. And after he brought back Dragon Joe, the sentence 'I brought back Dragon Joe' is somewhat intriguing." Kati nodded slightly. She crossed her arms, looked at Villia, and said, "What do you think is going on?" Villia's eyebrows stretched slightly, and she whispered, "I don't know, it's very strange, but I can't think of what happened." Kati was silent. Villia didn't know, and Katie didn't know either. In fact, I feel a little familiar with the girl that Chen Tao brought, Katie said. Valia glanced at Katie, then retracted her gaze and said, that girl is also a little strange. She knows about the existence of astronomical computers and the inner world. So far, there are not many people who know these technologies. And from her conversation, she seems to be very familiar with the inner world. There are even fewer people like this. Kadi frowned and frowned slightly. Could it be her? But this is unlikely. Kadi had a shadow in her heart, but she was not sure. After all, the gap between that girl and the shadow in Katie's heart was too big. Kadi suppressed her doubts and did not think much about it. At the same time, Chen Tao took Betty back to Yuehu Manor. Betty was in Chen Tao's arms, looking at the Yuehu Manor. Her eyes were shining, and then she looked at Chen Tao and said, "How did you do it?" Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty. "What did you say?" Betty said, "It's the guy named Stir in the picture. That guy is quite strong, but as soon as you went over and raised your hand, he was gone." "How did you do that?" Chen Tao looked at Betty, and saw a hint of curiosity in Betty's ruby-like eyes. Noticing this curious look, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile and said, "Want to know my technological secrets?" Betty was startled. She said, "Yes, I want to know." Chen Tao smiled and said, "Okay, then if you agree to let me get you completely, I will share my technology with you. How about it?" Betty blushed, glared at Chen Tao fiercely, and said, "Don't even think about it, I am the Red Dragon King Betty. I have dignity. You want to use me, to exchange for that, wishful thinking. Betty is not stupid. This kind of thing, no matter how you think about it, it's too disadvantageous. For the culture of the dragon people, if you give your body to a man, it is equivalent to giving everything, including your body and mind, to that man. Even if Betty gets technology from Chen Tao, if her body is given to Chen Tao, then what can she do if she gets that technology? She belongs to him, and the technology she gets will also be his. It's too much of a loss. Betty doesn't need to consider this kind of transaction, she can refuse it." Chen Tao looked at Betty and turned her face away, not looking at Chen Tao, with a puffy look on her face. Chen Tao felt inexplicably amused. Her personality was really interesting. "Okay, we're here, put me down." Betty twisted her body gently in Chen Tao's arms and wanted to get down. Looking at this scene, Chen Tao smiled and said, "I can't put you down. If you run away, where can I find you?" Betty was stunned. She looked at Chen Tao and said, "Nonsense, where can I run away? I can't use anything now, my genetic function can't be used, and I can't use the computer. My body is weaker than ordinary people, otherwise, I wouldn't be bullied by you like this." Thinking of the scene of being bullied by Chen Tao, Betty felt wronged. When she felt wronged, she held her mouth and looked at Chen Tao with the wronged luster in her big red eyes. The four eyes met. Chen Tao smiled and said, "Don't you like the feeling of being in my arms? Why do you want to get down so much?" Betty's face turned slightly red and said, Who said I like it?" Shameless, she turned her face away and didn't look at Chen Tao. Chen Tao was slightly startled, and then he smiled, "So you don't like it, then, should I hold you in my arms when I sleep in the future?" "Humph, if you don't want to hold me, then don't hold me." "I don't care." He said this, but Betty felt an inexplicable bitterness in her heart when she spoke. That was her favorite thing, was he going to deprive her of it? Chen Tao leaned close to Betty's ear and said, "But I like the feeling of holding you." The warm breath accompanied the sound into Betty's ears. Betty squinted her eyes and shivered all over. Betty turned around, blushing, glared at Chen Tao fiercely, and said, "Don't talk so close to my ear." Seeing this, Chen Tao was slightly startled. He couldn't help but smile and said, "So your ears are your sensitive area?" Betty's face turned redder. Huh, Lolita control, big pervert. She hid her face in Chen Tao's arms and said, "You only know how to bully people, I didn't do anything, but you keep bullying me." She puffed her cheeks and felt inexplicably wronged. She could indeed feel wronged, this man was too much. Although she said she would lead people to invade the dragon civilization, the team was dispersed before they arrived. After that, this man imprisoned her excessively and bullied her in various ways. He has not let her go until now, and does not respect her ideas at all. He only knows how to bully. It's too wronged. Looking at Betty's puffed face, Chen Tao's eyes were gentle, and he smiled and said, "It's almost noon, I'll bring you steak." Betty was startled, she raised her face, and her ruby-like eyes lit up. She looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes and said, All the grievances disappeared in an instant. What was left was expectation and joy. If Betty lay in Chen Tao's arms, she would be reluctant to come out of Chen Tao's arms, but when she heard that there was steak to eat, she could come out of Chen Tao's arms in an instant. Betty's love for steak is absolutely shocking. Seeing Betty's reaction, Chen Tao couldn't help laughing out loud. Ha ha. Betty blushed and said, "You're still laughing, still laughing." She beat Chen Tao's chest with her little hands unwillingly. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 238. Okay, Chen Tao stopped laughing. He looked at Betty and said with a smile, "I'll take you back to the bedroom and prepare steak for you." Betty's eyes were filled with luster. She pursed her thin lips and hummed softly, her eyes filled with joy. Chen Tao stretched his eyebrows slightly, and his eyes fell on Betty's thin mouth. There seemed to be a kind of magic power that made Chen Tao move closer involuntarily. Betty's face turned red. "You." She couldn't say the next words. "A gentle kiss." Betty's eyes were filled with confusion, her face was red, she slowly looked away, and hid her face in Chen Tao's arms. "Really, what did you do suddenly, you big bad guy?" Chen Tao smiled and stopped talking. He carried her back to the bedroom and put her on the bed. Like a kitten, Betty got into the bed, resting her head on the pillow, revealing a small face and big eyes looking at Chen Tao. Chen Tao smiled and said, "I'll bring you something to eat. You just stay here and be obedient, you know." Betty said, "Oh." Chen Tao then left. Betty looked at the closed door, her eyes glowing with luster, and she pursed her thin lips that had been kissed by Chen Tao. She felt her ears were hot and hid her face under the quilt. "Bad guy, Lolican." Betty's face turned red. Other side. Chen Tao returned to the cafeteria of base number 1. "Master, the steak is ready." Number 1 looked at Chen Tao with a smile. Seeing this, Chen Tao nodded slightly. He glanced at the steak that had been cooked on the dining table, smiled, walked over, and picked up the plate. However, at this moment, something incredible happened. Boom! Chen Tao could hear a deafening loud noise at that time. After the loud noise, a terrifying force came from below. Chen Tao's body flew up into the air. However, Chen Tao saw a white light coming from below. Boom! Accompanied by a loud bang. At the same time, looking in the direction of the Earth and the stars from the perspective of space, it can be seen that several huge cracks have split open on the Earth star as a whole, and white light is scattered from the cracks. Then, there was a loud noise. The entire Earth star was torn apart. Just like a basketball with a bomb inside, it fell apart instantly. When Chen Tao came back to his senses, everything he saw made Chen Tao a little confused. Chen Tao's figure is now in space, and there are broken pieces all around Chen Tao. Chen Tao frowned. "Nebula, what's going on?" Someone launched an attack on the Earth star. The energy generated by the attack was beyond the endurance of the Earth star, so the Earth star disintegrated and exploded. Nebula's mechanical voice sounded in Chen Tao's head. Chen Tao felt like his whole body was being pulled into an ice cave. Earth star, disintegrated. Chen Tao felt intense fear for a moment. Chen Tao is already the 6th generation gene body. He will not die, but what about the people around him? When he thought of the possibility, Chen Tao felt as if his body had fallen into a cold cave, and intense fear filled his body. No. It won't happen. Chen Tao suppressed his inner emotions. He entered the gene channel and said, Zi Ching, He Yuxuan, Wu Yao, Lin. Husband. A voice came. Several micro wormholes opened around Chen Tao. One girl after another walked out of the miniature wormhole. Zi Ching, He Yuxuan, Wu Yao, Lin, Fang Shueqing, Rose, Li Xiaolu, Vera and Philia. The girls in Earth Star are all here. Chen Tao breathed a sigh of relief. This was a great blessing among misfortunes. This is also normal. After all, Chen Tao has upgraded the bodies of these girls to 3rd generation genes. The explosion of the Earth Star will have no impact on them. Only. Chen Tao looked at the scattered gravel around him. Other Earthlings were not so lucky. Lin Na and the others are probably gone. Thinking of Lin Na, Chen Tao felt a little depressed and felt inexplicably unhappy. Although the relationship between Chen Tao and Lin Na is not that deep, they are still more or less Chen Tao's subordinates. Husband, what's going on? Zi Ching couldn't help but ask. Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at the girls. Lin looked at the rubble in front of her with a solemn expression. Chen Tao said, someone launched an attack on the Earth Star and destroyed it. Lin frowned. She crossed her arms and said, it is not uncommon for civilizations to destroy a planet, but it is rare to see such technology in the known universe without being monitored by Group Z and quietly destroying the planet. Group Z is an artificial humanoid built by Chen Tao to protect the Earth planet. Each of them has high-tech reconnaissance and combat capabilities. There are indeed very few civilizations in the known universe that can escape the detection of Group Z. It is very likely that it came from an alien civilization. Chen Tao looked at the planet fragments in front of him and felt a little relieved. Although the Earth Star was destroyed, as long as the loved ones are okay, the Earth Star can be rewritten, and humans can also rewrite it. For those humans who have nothing to do with themselves, it doesn't matter whether they are the original people or not if they are rewritten. Suddenly, Chen Tao felt a light flash in his head. Wait a moment. Chen Tao felt his scalp numb, and a sense of fear enveloped his whole body. He thought of a simple and innocent face. Betty. Chen Tao had a bad premonition. Betty's body is weak because of the effects of Dragon Man Zhou's lightning and wormholes, which caused her body to lack some genes. Even scissors can easily scratch her body. Can her body still maintain the invincible state of the 3rd generation genes? Thinking of this, Chen Tao hurriedly connected to Betty's gene channel and said, Betty. There was no response, it was empty. Chen Tao's heart sank slightly, and he continued, Betty. Still no response. Chen Tao's heart sank, and he said, Xingyuan, search for the data information of Red Dragon King Betty. Received the order, searching in progress. As long as Betty's data still exists in the known universe, Xingyuan can find her, and Chen Tao can also use that data to resurrect Betty. The search is over, there is no data of Red Dragon King Betty in the known universe. Xingyuan's emotionless voice slowly sounded in Chen Tao's head. Chen Tao saw a mirror, in which was Betty's smile, and at this moment, the mirror broke. Betty was so simple, so innocent. Just now, she was still expecting Chen Tao to give her steak. And now, dead. Not even a little data left. Chen Tao gritted his teeth and said, Xingyuan, start the time machine and go back to 20 minutes ago. No, no, she can't die. She can't die no matter what. Received the order, starting the time machine. Start time travel, target 20 minutes ago. Chen Tao closed his eyes, and the surrounding environment changed. Chen Tao came back to his senses and found himself in Yuehu Manor, and Betty was in Chen Tao's arms. Betty was puffing her face in grievance and said, "You only know how to bully people, I didn't do anything, but you keep bullying me." Seeing this, Chen Tao knew he was back. Chen Tao's figure disappeared on the spot, and appeared again. His figure appeared in the back hall of the Dragon King. This is where Chen Tao lives in Longren City. Betty was slightly startled when she saw it, and looked at Chen Tao. "What are you doing?" Chen Tao put Betty on the bed. He looked at Betty, then held Betty's little face with his hands and kissed her lips. Betty's eyes widened. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. My time is running out. Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 239. Chen Tao's figure returned to the sky above the earth, and he said, "Xingyun, monitor the earth, and find people who can threaten the earth except our own people." Received the order, investigating. Suddenly, a picture popped up in front of Chen Tao. In the picture, a woman in a white robe was on the Antarctic continent, flapping her wings and flying in the air. She was holding a white ball of light in her hand, and her eyes were coldly staring at the earth below. The woman waved her hand, and the ball of light shot towards the earth. The ball of light hit the earth in an instant. This series of actions came out in the instant when the picture popped up. When Chen Tao saw the ball of light flying towards the earth, he didn't have time to react. Boom! Accompanied by a loud noise. The earth in Chen Tao's field of vision was suddenly torn apart. White light lit up. Damn it, Chen Tao frowned. Xingyun, turn on the time machine and go back to the position where you jumped before. Chen Tao looked ahead and could see the picture of the earth being torn apart by the terrifying force. Received the command, start the time machine. Jump. Chen Tao felt the surrounding environment change. He came back to his senses. You only know how to bully others, I didn't do anything, but you keep bullying me. A familiar voice came to his ears. Chen Tao looked at Betty, who was puffing up her face and looking aggrieved in his arms. Time stopped. The surroundings turned into blue code. Chen Tao entered the inner world. Betty was slightly startled. She raised her face in Chen Tao's arms, looked around, and looked at Chen Tao. Did you open the inner world? Hearing this, Chen Tao looked at Betty's moving eyes, and he lowered his head. What? Betty was slightly startled. But Chen Tao had already approached. A kiss. The ruby-like eyes under Betty's narrow eyelashes trembled slightly. The two separated. Chen Tao looked at Betty and said softly, I have something to deal with. You stay at home. I'll prepare steak for you later. Steak? Betty's eyes lit up. Yeah. Looking at Betty's well-behaved appearance, Chen Tao smiled. He carried Betty to the door of the room that had turned into a blue code. Put Betty on the bed made of blue code. Chen Tao looked at Betty with expectation. He smiled and said, be good. I know, hurry up, I want to eat steak, Betty said hurriedly. Chen Tian couldn't help but smile. He stepped out of the door and closed it. His figure disappeared on the spot, and when he appeared again, he appeared above the Antarctic continent. In Chen Tao's field of vision, he could see blue codes, and in front of Chen Tao, above the Antarctic continent, there was a woman made of blue codes. Found you. Time resumed. Everything returned to its original state. Enter the surface world. Chen Tao could see the appearance of the woman in front of him clearly. The woman had white hair and white pupils. She had a graceful figure, and she was wearing a white robe. She held a light ball with a white halo in her hand. The woman noticed Chen Tao, her pupils condensed slightly, and her eyebrows wrinkled suddenly. She did not speak, and slammed the light ball in her hand towards the Earth star below. Chen Tao was prepared, and the light ball disappeared out of thin air the moment the woman let it go. It was directly analyzed by Chen Tao. The woman condensed slightly, her face changed slightly, and she looked at Chen Tao with trembling pupils. Chen Tao's mind moved. Chen Tao and the woman disappeared in the Earth star at the same time, and reappeared, and the figures of the two appeared on a desolate planet. The woman's face turned pale, but her eyes were still staring at Chen Tao, and her expression was as if she wanted to bite a piece of meat from Chen Tao. Chen Tao said, "Who are you? Why do you want to destroy the Earth star?" This is Chen Tao's question. The woman in front of him destroyed the Earth star twice. This time, Chen Tao stopped her. Chen Tao could have directly wiped her out, but Chen Tao wanted to know the reason. He had to know the reason. If he wiped out the woman without knowing the reason, he would have a question in his heart, which would make Chen Tao very uncomfortable. The woman said lightly, "My name is Usi, and Stir is my lover." Hearing this, Chen Tao's heart moved, and for a moment, he understood. "Are you here to avenge Stir?" Chen Tao crossed his arms. Usi said viciously, "Yes, I am here to take revenge. I want to destroy the Earth star. If the Earth star is gone, you will probably be fine, but one or two of your relatives will definitely die. I want you to experience the feeling of the death of your relatives." What a pity! Usi clenched his fists, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "It's a pity that you, this guy, actually found me when I was about to take action." Found her? Usi didn't know that she had destroyed the Earth star twice in two timelines. Although she failed to kill Chen Tao's relatives the second time, the first time left a strong impression on Chen Tao. Chen Tao stared at Usi and said calmly, "Since the operation failed, you should know the price." Usi stared at Chen Tao and said, "Chen Tao, I am not the only one who wants to avenge Stir. Stir is the god of the fifth universe, and he has many believers. You just wait to face endless revenge. And I, Usi, am just the first one in that endless revenge." Ha ha. Usi was laughing wildly, and her body was analyzed by Chen Tao and slowly dissipated. Not long after, the laughter disappeared, and Usi's voice also disappeared. Looking at the place where Usi disappeared out of thin air, Chen Tao frowned slightly. Revenge. Feelings are mutual. If the relatives around Chen Tao died, he would also be very painful and wish to kill the person who hurt her directly. But in the same way, Chen Tao killed Stir, and those people around Stir who regarded Stir as very important would also be in pain and would think of various ways to retaliate against Chen Tao. And this revenge is just the beginning. Chen Tao was inexplicably a little irritable. He suppressed the irritability in his heart, and his figure disappeared from the spot. His figure appeared in the dining room of base number 1. "Master, the steak is ready," the voice of number 1 came. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly, and his eyes fell on the dining table, looking at the steak that was already fried with steam. Chen Tao walked over and picked up the steak on the plate. He disappeared again and came to Betty's bedroom. "Ah, steak." Betty's eyes lit up when she saw Chen Tao coming back and the steak he was holding. Betty stared at the steak in Chen Tao's arms with a smile on her face. Seeing this, Chen Tao couldn't help but smile. He put the steak on the bedside table, then came to Betty and picked up the petite Betty. Chen Tao sat on the edge of the bed and held Betty in his arms. He gently hugged Betty's waist and said with a smile, "Do you need me to help you cut it? My time is running out." Author, Chen Wunian. Chapter 240. Betty hummed, nodded, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "I don't know how to cut." No. Chen Tao didn't think she couldn't. She probably didn't want to move and wanted to enjoy the feeling of being in Chen Tao's arms while enjoying the delicious taste of beef. All I can say is that Betty really enjoys it. However, Chen Tao didn't hate it, he also liked the feeling of feeding this little loli. Chen Tao could only let go of Betty's waist, picked up the knife and fork, cut a piece of beef, and placed it in front of Betty's mouth. Betty took a bite, chewed it, closed her eyes, finished the crescent moon, and said, "It smells so good, you haven't come to me these days, and I can't even eat it. It tastes so good." Betty opened her eyes, looked at Chen Tao, and said, "I want it more." Chen Tao smiled, "Okay, come." He ate around Betty while thinking about the next question in his mind. If Ste died in Chen Tao's hands, he would not be able to escape facing the revenge of the fifth universe. Chen Tao said to Nebula in his heart, "Starting from today, Nebula will conduct comprehensive monitoring of the Earth star. As long as there are any existences approaching the Earth star that carry weapons capable of destroying the Earth star civilization, let me know. After receiving the order, begin comprehensive monitoring of the Earth star." Nebula's mechanical voice sounded slowly. Hearing this voice, Chen Tao's eyebrows stretched slightly. In this way, Earth star will be safe. As long as Earth star is safe, then you can feel relieved about other things. Chen Tao's eyes fell on Betty in his arms. Betty was closing her eyes and enjoying the beef in her mouth. Look at Betty's baby face showing happiness. Chen Tao also laughed. This red dragon king Betty is so cute. Finished eating. Betty also realized that she had finished eating. She opened her eyes and looked at the empty plate. She puffed up her face and looked at Chen Tao and said, "Next time, make it bigger. It's so small and not enough to eat." Chen Tao smiled, "That's a steak for an adult. I really don't know what you are made of. You have such a small body and such a big appetite." Betty rolled her eyes at Chen Tao and said, "I am the Red Dragon King. My body is small, but I can refine everything I eat into energy and save it. No matter how much I eat, there will be no problem." "Save it? Isn't it just like fat?" Chen Tao said. "Wouldn't it be fat?" He looked at Betty's slender waist. "You are stupid." Betty gave Chen Tao a lovely eye roll and said, "My genes have evolved to this extent, and the energy that one cell can store is an astronomical figure. With this amount of energy, you want me to change fat?" "Hum." She snorted disdainfully. Looking at Betty with her hands folded across her chest, she looked disdainful. Chen Tao can be amused. Chen Tao hugged Betty horizontally. Betty was slightly startled. Chen Tao put Betty on the bed. Betty looked at Chen Tao. Chen Tao also got into bed, hugging Betty gently, with their two faces facing each other. Betty's eyes glowed. "Do you want to sleep?" Chen Tao smiled, looked at her big ruby eyes, and said softly, "After dinner, I plan to do some exercise with you." When Betty heard this, her face immediately turned red. She gave Chen Tao a roll of her eyes. "Lilican, what a pervert." She hid her body in Chen Tao's arms and said, "Don't think about it. I don't want to do the kind of exercise you want. If you want to sleep, just sleep. Anyway, you can't even think about that kind of thing." Chen Tao looked at the kitten-like girl in his arms. She didn't know that in another timeline, she had already died once. It was a death with no data left. Real death. Betty didn't know how panicked Chen Tao was when she died. In Chen Tao's opinion, it is also very magical. Chen Tao only regarded Betty as an interesting toy at first. Her arrogant character really added a lot of fun to Chen Tao, who was living a boring life every day. But feelings are something that cannot be controlled. Unconsciously, Chen Tao also developed feelings for Betty. Chen Tao didn't expect that Betty was already such an important existence to him. Thinking of this, Chen Tao said softly, "Betty." "What?" Chen Tao smiled and said, "With your body, will it be difficult to give birth?" Suddenly, Betty's face turned red, and she leaned into Chen Tao's arms. "What are you talking about? I don't want to give birth to a child when you ask this kind of question. I am the Red Dragon King Betty, who wants to give birth to you." "Child." Chen Tao was delighted and said, "I didn't say I wanted you to give birth to my child." "What?" Betty raised her face and looked at Chen Tao with her big eyes. You Don't you want to? There was a hint of uneasiness in her eyes. Chen Tao was stunned. Chen Tao couldn't help but smile bitterly, and said with a smile, I think so, are you willing? Betty blushed and looked away. I told you, I am Red Dragon King Betty, I don't want it. She is too arrogant. Chen Tao smiled, said nothing, and gently stroked her back to comfort her. Betty slowly closed her eyes. The two enjoyed this moment of tenderness. After a while, I think it should be fine. Betty's voice came. I said that although some accidents happened and my body became smaller, my genes still have some abilities. There should be no problem in giving birth to children or anything like that. Chen Tao was startled. He looked at Betty and found that Betty's cheeks were red. Seeing this, Chen Tao was happy. Is she still concerned about that topic? Chen Tao just wanted to tease her with that topic and see her reaction. He didn't want to do anything, but Chen Tao didn't expect that she would care so much. If I can change back to the size I used to be, I think it will be better. But, you are a lowly control. If I change back, I'm afraid you won't like it, Betty said slowly. Chen Tao's heart was slightly shaken when he heard it. He smiled and said, are you afraid that I won't like it? Are you in love with me? No. Realizing that she had let the cat out of the bag, Betty hurriedly shook her head. I didn't mean that. Ah. I don't care. She buried her face deeply in Chen Tao's arms and didn't dare to raise her face. It's so embarrassing. She actually let the cat out of the bag. Seeing Betty's little reaction, Chen Tao smiled and said, actually, no matter you are big or small, I like you very much. Betty blushed, I don't believe it, you are a Lolita control, a big pervert. If it weren't for your special fetish, how could you be so nice to me? Chen Tao was slightly stunned. Be nice to her? Chen Tao smiled bitterly. He just wanted to tease her and thought it was fun. At that time, he just treated her as a toy. And Betty, did she think that Chen Tao was nice to her? Chen Tao's bitter smile turned into a smile, which was fine. Chen Tao leaned close to her ear and said, I say, little cutie, I think it would be better for us to do some exercise.